Today, we're going to be discussing the beginning of what is called the second phase of the Industrial Revolution. And in particular, we're going to be looking at the impact that has on the United States and obviously the groups of people who are in the United States, but certainly have not been given their fair share of considerations, right? We're going to be talking largely about Native Americans, but we're also going to be talking about immigrants and immigration. So when we look through the next few moments, you'll be seeing those things and urbanization and a lot of the things that we discuss in contemporary world about problems of industrialization and the Industrial Revolution are part of this. So in the Industrial Revolution, which I'm sure is something that you have all heard of before, the Industrial Revolution is not a single event, right? The Industrial Revolution is a series of events that happens over the course of, well, starting in the 1750s and arguably going until today, is something that has fundamentally changed the way that everybody lives. And more importantly, how everybody lives, works, does pretty much every aspect of their life. It starts in 1750 and goes arguably, as I said, till today. But the period that we're going to be looking at is what's called the second phase. Usually the end of the 19th century, the end of the 1800s into the early 1900s. I usually give the dates roughly as like 1840 to about 1915 or so. And those are the periods that we'll be looking at, as I say, today. So the period that we're going to be discussing today, as I say, is the period really after the American Civil War, up until about the 19 teens or so. And this period is really sort of characterized or discussed with this sort of growth of the railroads, right? As the railroads, they fundamentally changed the way that people live for many reasons. But in the United States of America, railroads become the dominant mode of transportation really in the years leading up to the American Civil War and those immediately following it. Now, when you studied the American Civil War in other classes, you probably read that one of the major reasons that the North, the Union, wound up winning the Civil War is because of their railroads, right? And that is certainly true, but it was really all industrial products. And if you see here, in 1865, 35,000 miles of the track of the railroad in the United States, most of that, the vast majority of that would have been in northern areas. Now, when you look 25 years later in 1890, you now have 167,000 miles of track. Again, that would have still predominantly been in the north, connecting northern cities, but that would have started to push further south into the former Confederacy. Now, this growth of track is tremendous proportionally, right? In 35 years after the American Civil War, you have something like a 6 times increase, probably a little less than that, 5 times increase. But this huge growth of railroad interconnectivity changes commerce, changes cities, right? People now can move to cities. You can now sell your goods in cities. It really catapults this sort of population boom. And connecting to that, you obviously have, along with sort of Americans moving to cities, you also have the growth of urbanization for immigrants, right? People coming to the United States. So, as I said, this transportation change is phenomenal, right? You could travel between the coasts. It takes only 8 days, right? From a period before this where you were traveling by horse and carriage, it would take sometimes 3 months to make that travel. Now, with the railroads, you have huge, expansive changes to that. Along with that is communication. Telegraph wires follow the railroad lines, right? The trains need to communicate, but also people can communicate too, right? So you start having that move. You have new industries. As telephone lines grow up, they follow too. New industries are following, right? People moving money across as people are doing business. So you have, the growth of things like Western Union, American Express, as banks that help people, trade their money across expanses. This is, as I said, is creating huge changes to the way people are living, right? Because there's going to be industrial changes, there's going to be industry changes in other ways, and all of that becomes more and more dominant here. The one piece of this, though, and all those things probably sound relatively good. The major change here, though, that is a negative, and one of the many negatives, is the impact that this has on people such as the Native Americans, right? Native Americans are, obviously living in the Great Plains, and as the railroad is barreling through, their land is being stolen, they are being moved to other locations. The impact on Native Americans is going to be tremendous here. So the transcontinental railroads are created out of basically gifts from the United States government to the people who would build them, right? So the first, so you have the Pacific Railway Act that is passed in the middle of the American Civil War, where there are dollar subsidies, money subsidies given to companies to start going across the United States, right? So you get, for the company, you get $16,000 for every flat track that's laid, $48,000 per mile of mountainous track. Companies would also receive 20 miles on either side of their tracks, so that you could then either house the workers there, sell it to make more profit. It was a way to give money without actually having to give money, right? It was a way that if they give you this land, then that you can do with it what you will. And they begin to dig and they begin to work with the goal of making a connection in Utah. So they meet at the place is called Promontory Point in Utah, where they wind up, joining together. So you have the Union Pacific that is heading west from Omaha, Central Pacific from Sacramento, California, and they're heading east, and they meet in Utah. We're going to jump to this slide here, which shows you some of the major changes that happen in terms of railroad improvement, right? Coal becomes the dominant energy source here. And the importance to this is that you're going to have huge amounts of huge demand for coal. So places in the Appalachian Mountains and places in, out west, where you have the development of coal industries. People start building, more, or building more mines, or digging more mines. The major impact here, though, is also the steel production, right? Because steel is needed for railroad tracks and creating the railroads themselves. But you also can start to build cities, right? So steel can then be used in apartment buildings. So steel and the railroads go hand in hand. All of these things also mean that you need to be able to move your train across the railroads. So they standardize gauging for the tracks. They standardize time, right? You need to have a timetable. So if you're leaving New York at 1 o'clock p.m., if it's 12 o'clock in Nashville, and they standardize those times. So we have time zones. All of these things are again, meant to help the railroad industry, but they also obviously have larger impacts that need to be. Obviously, there are other major impacts that happen here too from the growth of the Industrial Revolution, right? One of the big things that happens is you have, obviously, the growth of steel, and the Bessemer process is a huge part of that. And the reading talks about Andrew Carnegie, the Scottish immigrant who comes to the United States and begins to work with the steel industry. That obviously is part of this as well. The other major thing, I've mentioned apartment buildings and the need of steel for those commodities, but the other major impact here is on food production. one of the big things that happens here is that you need more food to feed your growing population. So the cattle industry becomes a hugely significant industry because now you need to feed the growing people living in urban environments, but also obviously your workers. So cities like Kansas City, Missouri, becomes a huge depot for cattle, and Chicago. And if anybody here has been to um, the High Line in on the west side of Manhattan, right? That's an old cattle line, and if it dead ends in what is called the meat packing district, right? So the railroads and the cattle industry become hugely important. Cattle would be raised in places like Oklahoma, Kansas, Texas, and they would be marched to places like Kansas City. And they would get on a train and they would move to the different stockyards, Chicago and New York, as I've mentioned. There's obviously changes to different types of corporations, different types of industry changes as well, right? So you have, these robber barons, right? You have Carnegie, who I've mentioned, J.P. Morgan, who does a lot of the financing, Rockefeller with the Standard Oil Trust. You have Vanderbilt, right? Cornelius Vanderbilt, who obviously is a steel magnate. So you have all of these different growing industries that sort of have their captains of industry along with it. And you know, I obviously called him. I called these guys robber barons, right? And they are certainly, or they're the captains of industry, right? Depending on your political views, probably, you might see these gentlemen differently. Now, the impact that this has on other people is tremendous, right? The impact that this has on people such as the Native Americans is extremely important for us to understand, and your textbook discusses it, and I'm going to point it out in a moment. Native Americans had been given a lot of treaties over the course of their dealings with the United States government, and they had been given sort of different amounts of control. So some of the treaties give give the Native American people, their own territory, their reserves, their reservations, right? But that's not necessarily what is true going forward. So it's not always respected, and the United States, and we'll talk about that in just a second. There is more inventions being made to sort of break up the ground, right? So you have these sod busters, these people who are going in and breaking up the old dirt and sod and sort of old soil to try and make more money out of the ground. And again, this is taking away land from Native Americans. And one of the people who talked a lot about this is a guy named Chief Joseph, who is the chief of a Native American tribe, the Nez Perce Indians. And he gives this speech, right? Now, if you look at this, right, he talks about, sort of makes a historical case, right? The first white people who came were Lewis and Clark, and the Nez Perce were good to Lewis and Clark, and we made friends with him. And it further goes on, right? For the short time we lived quietly, we let you do what you needed, but then we could no longer do this. And all throughout, it's sort of the us versus them. On account of the treaty made by other hands, the Nez Perce and the white man claimed my lands, right? Again, all of these sort of things of being shown or illustrating the poor treatment by white Europeans, the Americans, the people who had moved in. So for Native Americans, a lot of disease had been brought into their territory because of obviously lower immunity, and I'm sure many of you have taken a course where you've heard of things such as the Columbian Exchange, right? So disease kills off a lot of people, but you also have a huge amount of famine that comes around, right? The Native Americans, had grown their grown food in their traditional lands, but now that they are, their lands are being removed, that might be tougher for them to grow. Or even further, right, the sort of massive amount of buffalo that were being killed by white folk and shipped back east is going to reduce the number of animals for Native Americans to eat. So again, you have these continued repercussions for Native Americans. So this period of urbanization and massive growth within American society really has a huge impact on business industry, urbanization, but also obviously on the lives of people who live in the land where the country is spreading.